Hello, dear listeners. Before we get to the episode, we want to take a moment to address the June 24th, 2022 Supreme Court decision to overturn Roe v. Wade. This decision stripped away the right to have a safe and legal abortion.
Everyone should have the freedom to decide what's best for themselves and their families, including when it comes to ending a pregnancy. This decision has dire consequences for individual health and safety, and could have harsh repercussions for other landmark decisions.
Restricting access to comprehensive reproductive care, including abortion, threatens the health and independence of all of us.
Learn more by visiting podvoices.help. If you're able to support others, please consider donating to abortion funds, as Planned Parenthood and Democrats generally have enough money. You can help by donating to local abortion funds, and to find out where to donate for each state, you can visit donationsfораbortion.com. That's the number 4, donationsfораbortion.com.
We encourage you to speak up, take care, and spread the word.
Welcome to Nerds at Church, a podcast about nerdery and the Bible. I'm Pastor Kay, and I use pronouns like she and her.
And I'm Pastor Emily, and my pronouns are they, them, theirs.
And I'm Pastor Nick Peñaranda, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers.
In this episode, we'll discuss the 6th Sunday after Pentecost, also known as Proper 11 or Lectionary 16, which this year falls on July 17th. We do have a couple content notifications for this episode. We talk about transracial adoption when discussing the deep dive, and pregnancy and the Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization that overturned Roe v. Wade during the first reading.
Check out the episode description for links to the Bible passages and other references we make in this episode.
This week, for our deep dive into invisible and emotional labor, we have special guest Reverend Nick Peñaranda, who is the creator of Mon Advocacy. Did I say that right? I was going to ask you beforehand.
Yeah, Mon Advocacy. Good job.
A racial justice resource grounded in play. She is passionate about queer Black liberation, cultivating diverse leadership in faith spaces, and the art of creation. Welcome!
We're so glad to have you with us.
I'm so glad to be here, y'all.
So, I'm curious about Mon Advocacy, and if you could tell us just a little bit more, because it sounds, right, racial justice resources are frequently offered, I imagine, without compensation. So there's like an aspect of invisible and emotional labor that goes into it that people just don't recognize. But also, maybe, this is not, but also racial justice resources grounded in play.
That sounds
makes me
wonderful.
really excited. Can you tell us more?
I would love to, yeah. So you'll probably learn by the end of this that I'm very much a creative, and I have a kind of strange background with like youth ministry, youth work, etc. So to give you the full story, back in like 2018, I was invited to go to the ELCA Youth Summit. And at the Youth Summit, I was asked to talk about racial justice advocacy. And I'm like, all right, well, how do I talk to a bunch of high schoolers about this without using those regular terms that tend to just kind of like go over people's heads, you know?
Sure.
Like, and not saying that they don't have the capacity to grasp that, but sometimes you hear microaggression so many times, right? You don't even think twice about it.
Yeah.
So how do we have that conversation? So I sat down for a while and I thought, oh my gosh, let me use the game that we all know and grew up with, which I will not name because I do not need a lawsuit. But there's a particular game that we all grew up with. And I was like, how fascinating would it be if this was adjusted in a way that you played with different levels of power and privilege? And the board reflected the city of Chicago. And the way that it goes is that like you sit down and you play for a while, but then like your particular cards that you pull will completely impact the game. Not just you as an individual, but other folks that might fall into some of your same social locations.
Sure.
And so the idea is that we are playing in a world that is adjusted in a way where some people have more advantages than others. And it's just what it is. And they're all based on actual facts. They're based on Forbes magazine's breakdowns of, pay by race. It's based on actual experiences that have happened or lawsuits.
Sure.
So none of it's just like fluffed and made up. It's like, no, these are real life things. So people can play and essentially be in a different position than what they may have like grown up with. And what I always remind them is that even though you're playing with a different level of power and privilege, you are also still who you are as a person. So the mentality you bring with it, right? Your relationship to money, for example, right? Those things are also going to impact how you exist and operate on the board. So there's a lot of different levels to it. A good friend of mine called it Sociology 101 in like
Awesome.
So, I created this again for this particular group, and it was done well enough where folks said, oh, you should sell it. You should do this. You should do that. And I'm like, well, if I sell it, I don't maintain my power of being able to actually like operate with it. And then people can kind of do nasty things with it if they want. And I don't want that either.
Yeah.
But.
And also lawsuits.
I now understand the name of the organization. It took me a minute, and then I was like, is this?
Just in case anyone hasn't figured it out yet, I suppose I could ask, are the playing pieces different, or do we still get to fight over whether we're going to be the little Scotty dog or the top hat?
Great question. Wink. So actually it's funny because in this game, while I wish that was a thing still, because I had to do it kind of last minute, I ended up buying actually little Beanie Babies. So there's like a llama Beanie Baby or like a unicorn Beanie Baby.
That is even better. Yes.
But yeah.
That's fabulous.
Yeah, it's a good time. And that is a lot of emotional labor, right? It was done as a thing to be free. Sure. And, part of the booking requirements that I've made, right? There is a price with it. And it's hard because I want people to have particular experiences. And some people haven't necessarily come through with, trying to go forward with it, right? So it's hard to continue to try to market yourself in that sense.
Yeah. There's like a thing about marketing yourself and advocating for yourself that particularly for those of us who have been socialized as women or girls, whether or not that's right, like that's not how I identify now, but I still have that socialization drilled into me.
Absolutely.
Sure.
And like the advocating for being paid enough, advocating for compensation and recognition, and advocating for your knowledge and wisdom being respected is like all yeah.
And we see that in how people prioritize this stuff. I think when you mentioned the racial justice piece, a lot of people expect particular things for free, but you'll also see amongst our counterparts and even more public figures, the way men or masculine presenting people tend to be more willingly compensated for what the work that they do, and then whereas femme presenting women, non-binary
people,
right, that it's kind of like we can like pay for your flight and make sure your food's taken care of, right? And it's just like,
yep.
I
had an experience on a synod committee that was really working on like how to have difficult conversations, particularly across race and gender and sexuality and stuff. And I was one of the co-chairs, and a lay Black woman was the other co-chair. And we had this idea for like education for a fall theological or something. We were like, and you should pay. And I was very clear about, and you should be paying us for doing the facilitating and stuff. They went with two cishet white people, and paid them, I'm pretty sure. And I was like, okay.
Yeah.
Ding, ding, ding.
If I never have to call in an old white guy from the synod to tell people what I just told them 5 minutes ago so that they will actually believe it again, it will be too soon.
Yes. That is real. Yeah. But as you're talking about, and as I imagine this game shows, there are a lot of forms of invisible, which really just means invisible to the dominant culture or middle upper class labor that happens in this country, from farm workers to childcare, house cleaning, janitorial staff, waste collection and management, plus parenting and household care that's not even paid, and caring for aging parents, all of that stuff. Why isn't this kind of labor noticed? Like, what do these kinds of laborers have in common? What is going on that they're just like not acknowledged or appreciated?
Oh, that is such a heavy load, and I feel like I can go on a huge tangent with this. So
Mm-hmm.
forgive
Go
me
for
ahead
it.
of time.
Go.
Look, we
Yep.
actually planned this deep dive with fewer questions than usual because we figured all of them would inspire rants,
Yeah.
which is fine.
So I feel like with this one, right, I think off rip we want to be like women, right? Like the labor of women oftentimes just goes completely undervalued, and we see that with childcare. And not even within the house. When you think of who actually does the daycare,
Sure.
and when you think of actually what we're forced to pay as parents for childcare, which is expensive, but even daycare workers don't actually make a lot of money.
No.
Yep.
You know, which is like the complicated part. It's just it's not subsidized.
Yeah.
Right.
So, you know, the first thing that comes to head is always, right, the labor of women is never valued. We see that with, you know, cooking and cleaning are also great examples of this, where professional cleaning services, which like the janitors, whichever kind of, you know, custodians, you're thinking waste management, which is literally, right, you know, you're cleaning up. Those are all dominated by men.
Yeah.
In a paid profession. Whereas in terms of the folks who are obligated to clean homes, like your actual home that you live in tends to be a wife, the feminine partner, you know,
Sure.
you know, or the girlfriend. I think the same thing could be said around cooking, right? Where we see professional chefs who dominate the actual culinary scene tends to be men. Whereas who's the person that's always cooking within your home? Majority of the time, it ends up being a woman in that sense. And that's obviously very like heteronormative, very binary in that sense.
Yeah.
And right.
And even when like there is intentionality about like splitting up responsibilities, cooking is much more fun than cleaning the dishes.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Right?
So much.
So who does the cooking and who does the cleaning the dishes? Like growing up, my dad was the cook, still is. And then my sibling and I shared responsibilities for doing the dishes. But there is that, like, even when people are trying to be egalitarian, the fun stuff still tends to shift towards men, and the not as fun towards men. Yeah.
Right. I think there's a lot to be said about that. I also think of in terms of other undervalued work, I was also hearing you mentioned other labor movements. And that brings me to the thought around like classism and colorism.
Sure.
And so that came up. So if you don't know this about me, I officially have a TikTok problem.
Me too.
We're glad that you can share this with us.
I felt like this was a safe space. I really appreciate that. But even outside of TikTok, right? Like I knew that this was a thing. Like I'm a woman of African descent, and the dark skin, light skin conversation consistently comes up. Folks, you know, who worked in the fields and who worked in the house, and like, you know, and I say it like that because that's how we, at least as children, because children just pick up what's around them, right?
Sure.
That's the way that we've talked about complexion and things like that. And I see how that trickles out into other non-Black, but also, how do you say, multicultural communities of like, the idea of being like fair skin is connected to wealth, to royalty, to being able to like stay out of the sun, right? Because you didn't have to do labor work, like laborious work. And so white skin, pale skin, you know, is glorified, which goes into a lot of other things. Whereas darker skin, tan skin is associated with labor, it's associated with being outside, it's associated with doing work that people would pay someone else to do, which means that you are not only an oppressed group or a marginalized group, right? But you're a group in need. And so I think because of those things as well, a lot of that invisible labor, you know, plays a part in that. And, you know, so essentially, as long as you are a marginalized body in some respect, the work that you do will almost never be as valued as others.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yep. Yeah. Even in the space of justice work around that particular identity.
Yep.
And, yeah.
So, like we've said, so much invisible labor falls invisibly to women, to people of color, and particularly to Black women. And so we specifically wanted to talk to you today because not only are you a Black woman who is a pastor, but you're also a mom, among other awesome roles. And so we were wondering, how do you navigate expectations and assumptions about your labor, both professionally and personally?
That's a really great question. And I've been thinking about this a lot as we were getting ready to approach this. I struggle with this because in the areas where I feel that I'm setting boundaries for some of that stuff, like around like housework, Like,
Mm-hmm.
I'm not a domesticated lady. I love to cook. Don't get it twisted, you know. I can clean a bathroom, but you're not gonna. I think it was when I literally turned 30 where I like started waking up at like 6 a.m. on a Saturday and being like, I'm gonna clean the kitchen. But that took a really long time.
Yeah.
But there's other things. Like, I think when we even talk about labor, we think of the physical work, right? Like the cleaning up behind the house, the staying up a few minutes after your kid goes to bed to pick up behind them. But there's other things that I have been struggling with. And a part of that has been what makes a family. And I want to be really clear about that. Not the like, oh, I love you. Oh, we're like close and we're doing this. But when you don't live in the same house as like your parents or your siblings or your cousins, you don't live in the same area. Unless you intentionally put in the work to maintain a relationship with those people, those relationships will just kind of dwindle and fall to the bottom. Right. So there is an expectation that someone has to do that work. And that's something like, that's the kind of labor that I'm noticing is like hard. Like, I don't think we talk about that part a lot.
Yeah.
As someone who's raising like a small child, like I want my kid to know their cousins, their relatives and whatnot. But unless someone is putting out the work, and we live by like my husband's family, my side is out on the East Coast. And I already do that of like calling them every day, keeping them on FaceTime, you know, so they don't miss a beat. But I find myself having to do some of that work of being like, we should probably go out and see your cousins, or we should probably go to this party. Yeah. We should prioritize that. It's so little, but it becomes a lot, right, when you're the one constantly doing it. Or being like, our kid needs to have a social life, right? They should have friends in the community. We should hang out with friends, right? We too should go out and like be in community and relationship with people. And a lot of times, if you tend to be in one of these kind of like heteronormative relationships, there tends to be that like,
you become the social secretary.
Yeah, thank you. What a freaking word. In terms of like how queer family does it so differently, like that kind, some of that labor that we're speaking of, right? You find that a lot again in these kind of like het norm relationships. And even though I myself am not a heterosexual person, right? It just, this is how the shoe fell, I guess, whatever.
Sure.
But when I think about how, so one of my really dear friends who is also my doula, actually my labor is what got her to say, okay, I'm gonna actually take this on more seriously. And so she almost exclusively does queer family doula work. Love that for her. I think it's great. And as a doula, no obligation to any of these families, aside from bringing that child out, right, has set up mutual aid opportunities to make sure that these families are like getting the support that they need, especially during a time of COVID, has like shown up for them. And then her community, right, other, queer folk within this area are showing up for them, right? And like, that's just something that I think consistently just like reminds me of just like how wonderful we are when we are free from this hell that is a binary. like, look how amazing this is. The other thing though that I wanted to bring up around labor as we were talking about this and was the labor of culture. So I'm in an interracial marriage. I come from an interracial relationship and my mom is white. And you see this a lot with like the white mom, black dad situation. A lot of kids, again, TikTok, right? That will talk about though, like growing up essentially in whiteness and learning white womanhood first, because that's the only thing their mom, my mom, right, could teach, because that's their life, that's their world. But when we're wondering why we didn't grow up with like particular attributes from other relatives, communities and whatnot, because that's not what that one person, what your mother can like offer. And this goes in a lot of interracial family systems, right? Like culture tends to be passed down through women. So even if you did grow up in a family where like, no, I got a lot of my dad's side, right? But like, who taught you that? Was that your dad or was that your grandmother? Was that your aunt?
Or even your mom teaching for your dad?
Oh my God. Right? But that's a thing. And I think that's another part of this like emotional labor conversation that tends to kind of go away, of like culture tends to be passed down like maternally, because the labor of raising kids, the people, when you think about like, generationally too, right? Like boomer dads did not really talk to you, right? It would be really great if they even acknowledged you one day of the week. Right? So, but there's a huge chunk of culture that gets lost if there is not a woman in your family teaching you that. for better or for worse. But we don't talk about that part either. And that's something that has just like kind of come up again as more people that come from interracial backgrounds talk about this stuff. And they wonder why it always is the way it is, right? How did it end up like that? And it's this flavor, you know, like, so yeah, that's something that was also on my heart too from that.
Yeah. As you were talking about it, I was like, oh, yep. Like, I know multiple white women who are either either have biracial kids with their partner who is not white or have adopted kids, and who are, I think, mostly the kids that they've adopted have been Black. And I see, like, I am more friends with the women than with the men, right? So there's that dynamic. But I see the labor that they do to make sure that their kid's hair gets done right, that they are teaching their kid about, like, maintaining that cultural connection for their kids. And that's, like, people who are, like, more invested and involved in racial justice, right? So they have read the articles, perhaps, or watched the TikToks about the importance of maintaining that culture. But, like, think about the Indian Child Welfare Act that is being completely gutted right now. And, like, the importance of that was, you cannot just take Native kids from their families and their communities and put them with white families, because that is actually genocide.
Yeah.
Also, like, there are laws that say you can't do that now, and that's still happening. And it's still, like, the ways that kids of color in particularly are put in foster care faster are, like, the kids of immigrants who came and were detained and then parents deported, and the kids get adopted into white families because it's not safe to send the kids back to the country they just sent the parents back to. Like, all of those dynamics of how, like, structurally we're actually, like, impeding even the way, like, the cultural labor. We're, like, just cutting it off as a country to be like, nope, you don't get to learn and know your culture. We're going to make you as white as possible in this foster home or adopted home, or
right. Not to mention the media we consume. Yeah.
Right. And I was thinking, even when you mentioned the hair thing at first, I'm like, and only that in itself is a recent thing. Like, because I know when I was growing up, like, the idea of, like, white moms thinking that they had the responsibility to, like, actually figure out how to do their children's hair was, like, absurd, you know? And that, I mean, there's a lot of fetishizing kind of stuff that's also really weird with that kind of child bringing. But like, I think you hit a lot of really important points around what this means in terms of culture, raising children, and again, like that invisible labor, right? And that goes away. Like like a lot of that goes away. Yeah. Right? When we're removed from that stuff.
Yeah.
I think what's so important there too is, like, it's not that any of these, like, previous, I don't even call them stereotypes, but, like, caricatures of women, of, like, what we focus on, what we prioritize. Like, none of that's wrong. It's just empty, right? Because exactly that, right? Like, there was no other representation, no other opportunity for us to see ourselves in the way that we might have perceived ourselves. So trying to fit into this, like, box of, like, what femininity is, what womanhood is, it just didn't work. And then the few times, especially, like, when you think of, like, Disney movies, that you did get the one who's like, I don't really fit in. By the end of the movie, like, you know, they spend their whole time conforming to this other identity. Yeah. It's like, it's so terrible.
Or the I'm not like other girls.
I'm not exactly.
No, look, we are actually all. Yeah.
It's so boring.
People.
Yeah.
And let's be honest, Fleur Delacour is going to be terrifying when she gets older.
Oh, absolutely.
And that's going to be awesome to watch. So,
yeah. I think there's great. So as we were talking about TikTok before, and it sounds like a lot, we're entering a lot of conversation around the women's thing, but there is one particular artist or creator that I really appreciate who, like, took, like, Avril Lavigne songs and played, like, the girl that Avril Lavigne is constantly talking about. She's just like, sis, I don't know why we're fighting right now. Like, I don't know why you're mad at me. You know, and she's just like, why can't I like ballet or gymnastics or be a cheerleader? Like, what is the problem with that? Why are you such a hater? It's so good. But yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So another piece of this is each of us, and we've kind of talked about it some, but I think there's a bit of a nuance that I kind of want to tease out. Each of us has experiences of marginalization in terms of gender among other pieces of our identity, which comes with a lot of assumptions about emotional labor. And we talked about this a little bit in terms of like racial justice work, but I'm curious if you can explain a bit more of like that nuance of like what emotional labor is, because it's not just like not being paid or not being paid as much for justice work, but like there is an expectation of emotional labor too. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yes. Sometimes these things are really hard for me to like define, and all I can do is like point to those examples.
Yeah.
Sure.
But like apparently by definition, right? Emotional labor is like the process of managing feelings and expressions to fulfill the emotional requirement of a job, right? We'll call it a job. And so when I think of emotional labor, right, like I think of on like an organizer level, when you're out here trying to like organize for a victory, right? Let's say in the city of Chicago right now, it's water for all.
Mm-hmm.
So the work behind the Water for All campaign, which Soul Southsiders Organizing for Unity and Liberation are doing, it's to make sure that water is controlled, right? That it is like controlled, accessible, and guaranteed, and that water doesn't get cut off even if you don't pay a bill. Because right now there are water shutoffs that are happening across different parts of the city of Chicago, especially the South Side, and they tend to be in a lot of Black and Brown communities, right? Because people are missing bills. The charge for water, like in some areas, like I think it increased like about 4 times within a 4-year period. So it makes like a basic need inaccessible. When I think of emotional labor there, like I think of just the fact that like someone had to care enough about this, but then as you go like door to door and finding out what people's actual needs are, right? Like you have to carry that. You have to hold that. And that ends up being your driving force around it. But what tends to happen too sometimes, depending on how invested or embedded you are in such community, you might also pause some of your work to find some of those immediate solutions for people, right? And you have to carry that. Like you have to carry that work. Like you're not obligated to it, right? But like you need to do that because you know that like somebody's kids is not getting access to water that day. Or you have people that are calling you up about the hardship that they're going through. Like I think of that like with pastoring, right? You go to a congregation and you're carrying the burden and workload of your people in your community. Some people have the ability to just be like, boop, cool, I'm done with it, whatever. That's not
compartmentalizing.
Exactly, right? Or just being able to say, oh, that really sucks for them. That's a really hard thing.
Yeah.
Let me go take my long bubble bath now. Where other people spend a lot of time, sitting with that and trying to find resolutions to whatever said conflicts might be because they recognize like the deeper impact. And I think when it comes to, as a parent, when I think of that work, right? Like you're managing not just needs, right? But like some of the emotional stuff within your whole family. And that often means that you have to put your own stuff aside to make sure that other needs are being met, or that you're carrying on additional burdens simply because of what your parental role is. And that doesn't necessarily mean that that is a shared thing from both or every parent.
Yeah, so often when I think of emotional labor, I think of helping other people to manage their emotions because they don't know how, or they don't even realize that they have to right then, or because they've been pushed beyond their limits and they just can't right now. And so many families have that one person who is the acknowledged person that like we all have to help them do their emotions because they're not going to do it on their own, and if we leave them alone then they're just going to explode. Or
the opposite, right? The one person who does all of the
manages
emotional
emotions
labor
for everyone else, who oddly enough always seems to not be a man. Funny how that works. Not always, but so often. And you do have to be taught how to do that. That is a learned skill.
Absolutely.
And it seems like in some places schools are starting to focus on that a little more, because I noticed that my confirmation students, my middle school students, seem to be getting better at it overall. And I love to see that, and that is such a relief, because I did not have those skills. But being that person in the family is exhausting, and constantly doing the mental calculus of how is this person going to take this piece of news and what can I do to mitigate that is exhausting. And you're not just planning the housework, you're also planning how people are going to react to the housework. You're also planning how people are going to react to which pieces of housework you have to let go because you have other stuff to do. And you know that this big event is coming up, and so you have to manage 4 different people's expectations of what they're going to be asked to do, what they're actually going to be able to do, and how they're going to appreciate or not appreciate other people's contributions and all of that. And so a lot of it does tend to focus on family, and often in relationships, in romantic relationships, tends to be where we wind up talking about it. Thus my story earlier of the mother-in-law who gave the giant book of addresses and birthdays.
Yeah.
There was a conversation some time ago on a website called Metafilter about emotional labor, and it wound up being very centered on cis-hetero relationships, but there were some stories that weren't a part of that, and some stories about work and like how women wind up doing the soft skills stuff at work so often. And why do we call it soft skills in the first place? And I really appreciated that. There used to be a summary of the conversation that was only 50 pages long. But that was really well organized. But unfortunately, I think that's been put behind a password wall or something now, so you can't access the summary. But the original is still super interesting, and I have literally given people this link, and then they started to cry. Again, always women. Almost always heterosexual women, because it was so revelatory for them, because they knew all this stuff, they just hadn't had words for it before. But again, this is part of the invisible labor that people wind up getting stuck with, and yet it does take so much of an emotional toll, and it can be so exhausting. And so how do we create relationships where we can actually talk about this? How do we create relationships where we can help each other manage this and bring this out into the open, I guess?
Well, first of all, feel free to delete everything that I just said about emotional labor, because I think your description was so much better. But all I got from both of it was it's either, regardless of what it is the person doing that work does not have permission to have their own feelings.
Yes. Absolutely. There's the words I was looking for.
That's the heat of it. And this actually just happened to me, so that's why I'm super I was ooh, that was a trigger moment. Let me get myself together. But I don't have to go into that today. Honestly, I don't know, and I don't think for me it goes back to raise your children better. Raise your and
I feel kind of guilty using that phrasing, though, when you're a parent and I'm not. I'm not gonna...
Don't tell me how to raise my kids. But
exactly, see?
But for me, that's just kind of that's just what it feels like for me, especially when you see and again, I really hate this conversation because it is so gendered, but it's because we're in a culture that is hyper gendered.
Yeah.
So a lot of these things, even though it's not all on all the sides, right? But it still very much is most. So you can't ignore it. And I still feel so uncomfortable in how we're describing it. But I just wanted to name that. But for real, it is this you need to raise your kids better. And it's not putting blame on children, but it's our responsibility as parents. People keep saying, right, don't have kids unless you want to raise humans, unless you want to raise adults. Because that's what your job is not just to have a cute little pet on the side, but it's about making someone whole, right? It's tending to the emotional needs of your kids. It's tending to who you want your child to be when they grow up. And so we do the thing where we're oh, boys are so easy to raise, right? Because no, you just let them run around outside with no accountability whatsoever.
And that's where toxic masculinity comes from.
Right? And then when you have young girls or children that are assigned female at birth, there is so much boundary drawing. There is so much what you can and cannot do. There is so much they're just hitting you because they like you. So therefore, you have no reason to be upset about this thing, right? So at such a young age, we're already telling children assigned female at birth that your feelings here are not a priority because someone else we've determined has stronger feelings and emotions, right?
Yes.
Or if the little brother's bullying you, oh, just suck it up, right? Oh, they're your little brother. Or, there's so much older daughter trauma that you'll see because they become obligated to raise all these other kids. And what happens when you're a parent, right? This is that emotional labor stuff, right? As a parent, you just can't be freaking out on your kids because they did something you don't like, right? You need age appropriate responses to behavior. And so like them, you know, barking out at you, that's age appropriate at 3-4 years old because they're still trying to figure out their own emotions, right?
Sure.
I'm now ranting, so I'm going to pull myself back. But it's like, until we do a better job on how we engage our children, it's really hard to have those conversations later in life, because also as a grown woman, I don't want the responsibility of raising your child, like your adult child.
The number of like this narrative of like, and it's mostly from heterosexual women, I think, and probably maybe heterosexual white women, that like, I'm raising, like if they have 2 kids and a husband, I'm raising 3 kids. And it's like,
ew.
But like, as a queer person, there is so much where I look at it and I'm just like,
yeah, no, as a straight person, I'm right there with you. Well, mostly. I married a grown-up. Thank you. That was on purpose.
Yeah. But I think this goes into one of my like favorite rants, right? Which is, people who are assigned female at birth are taught to be nice. And I think being nice is a sin, because it is not, right? Like there's a difference between being kind and being nice for me. But being nice is, your sibling is bullying you. Oh, be nice. Be nice and share is be nice and give up your toy. Don't make waves. Don't assert yourself. Don't like stick up for your own feelings. Acquiesce to their emotional needs. Yeah. So I'm very much a like, being nice is a
who
sin.
Other people need you to be instead of yourself.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the truth is that you can learn these skills as an adult. It's harder. You have to put actual effort into it, but I've seen it happen. But yeah, you can learn these things as an adult. I will again shout out the online advice column, Captain Awkward, which does a lovely job of teaching boundaries and relationship skills that I have found super useful. But it takes so much work, and so many people are not up for it and will just assume that other people will do it for them.
Exactly. They're not up for it. And some people, and I think I see this in anti-racist circles, so I'm going to just call it what it is, because it's,
I bet.
Because a lot of this stuff all intersects, which is why we've jumped from like culture, emotional labor of women, like, you know, like all of these things intersect, because a huge part of this is around boundaries and receiving criticism. We also, in our culture, do a horrible job of being open to feedback and criticism. Granted, some of us suck at delivering it, we'll be honest.
Right.
Yeah.
But we do a horrible job of receiving it. So if we say, this is problematic, or like, I can't be in a relationship with something like this, or like, this is such and such for me, a lot of people's gut reactions are not to just like sit with it and like reflect on it and take it, but it's immediately to be combative. It's immediately to reject and go the other way, which is why we see this huge white supremacist movement and this like nationalism, zealot stuff happening, because people are they get so hurt when they think that they're wrong at something, rather than being willing to correct themselves.
Sure.
Yeah. And the flip side of that, like, there is the like radicalization into white supremacy side, but the flip side is also like in anti-racist circles, but like also in queer circles, also in all of the intersecting circles, right? Like, to acknowledge when harm has been done, or to be publicly called out, and then to have the like white people around you be like, oh, you're not a bad person, oh, you didn't mean it.
Right.
And it's like, no, like, the point of apologizing for bad behavior is not to be coddled. The point for apologizing for bad behavior is to apologize for bad behavior and make plans to do differently in the future. Or when someone calls you out, it's because they think that you might actually listen and do something differently. Like, if they are someone who is in any sort of relationship with you. It's like cancel culture, which doesn't actually exist, because the only people that ever get canceled are the marginalized people. But like, cancel culture is about consequences for your bad actions.
Yeah. Well, and that dichotomy that you mentioned of the being able to give criticism well and being able to receive it well, if you only try to teach one side of that, it's gonna all fall down.
Yes.
And it's not gonna work, because like when I was going through seminary, they were trying, bless them, to figure out how to do that. And they were failing miserably, but they were trying. And we wound up with the skill of, okay, you have to receive criticism well, but no one was teaching how to give criticism well. And so what wound up happening was that so many of my classmates and people in my approximate time in candidacy wound up just straight up getting bullied. In the process and of becoming pastors. And because there was no paying attention to how do you give constructive criticism, how do you address issues in a adult and mature way, and that destroyed a lot of people's emotions.
Yes.
And stopped a lot of people from becoming pastors who would have been excellent at it.
Yeah. Last year on Pride Month, it has been less so this year, though a couple times it has happened. Pace, Warfield May, who is a friend of this podcast and my co-host for Horror Nerds at Church, came up with Pace's spicy pride ratings.
I love those.
And so it would be like posts that people made that like named realities of queerness or educated or like those sorts of things, and sometimes criticized like bigger things going on. And then you would get a rating between 1 and 5 peppers of like how spicy it was. One of the things that I didn't always love is like people pushing back or like asking questions, right? Or those sorts of things. And so then we started, this like group of us started going through, and when people like were pushing back or making comments, or when queer people were doing lots of emotional labor during Pride Month about something, then we'd go in at the bottom of the comments and be like, hey, FYI, this is a lot of emotional labor that this person is doing for you all. Here's their Venmo. Or what's your Venmo? And like, I think maybe 1 or 2 times somebody actually like Venmoed money for that. But like that push of like, we're going to name it as emotional labor, which I think is one of the steps that like is a first step, right? Like we have to actually like name, I am doing emotional labor right now for you, and I am doing it willingly or not willingly, paid, whatever, but like naming emotional labor for what it is, and then being like, and so here's a way that you can pay me. I'm doing this out of the goodness of my heart and because I believe that like we can make a better world, and you need to know how you are impeding that. And also like, here's a way to compensate for that work. And I haven't seen it as much in other months, but part of me just wants to like go in on like in February and just be like, okay, this person is doing all of this emotional labor. What is your Venmo for folks who are reading these posts that you're making that are really important posts? Speaking of emotional labor and the church and all of the things, there are particularly racialized ways, which we've kind of talked about some, but especially in the church, that the church sets expectations for who people will be and how people will exist in the church. And I think particularly for all of us as members of the ELCA, which is like ridiculously frequently touted now, the whitest denomination in the country, right? Like there's a particular extra labor pressure, all of that stuff. And you recently illustrated an incredible new kids book, which is going to be my new thing whenever we talk about darkness or lightness or whatever. And a shout out to bookshop.org, because mine already arrived, even though it's still in pre-ordering time. So it's like, yes. And part of what it does is it challenges some of the assumptions that are made in the church. Can you tell us about the book and kind of like why you did it? Just gush about the book, please.
So as we talk about emotional labor and all the stuff in between, I want to start by saying I actually illustrated this book while I was running for office, while I was pastoring a congregation. I did not
realize all 3 of those were happening at once.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And I had a 1-year-old at the time, so it was a lot. Yep. So I illustrated this book that Cherie Green and Becca Selnick wrote together. Mm-hmm. I actually have it here with me. Really happy about that. Yeah, so Becca had approached me, I want to say maybe that like September or October, and was like, hey, I want to write this book. Cherie recommended you. And I was like, hey girl, that's really great. I'm not a real artist. I say that, but like also like
I was like, whoa.
the year before that, I had just did a mural in Argentina when I was on internship. The year before that, I was doing like kind of art therapy with like my students when I was living in Philly and did like several pieces while I was in seminary, you know? So I'm like, I'm not a real artist because I would call myself self-taught. Like I took classes in high school, you know? Like, I don't know if like, I don't know. Anyway. But I was kind of like, this isn't really my ministry. Like, I've never done this. And she's like, yeah, whatever. Like, it's cool. Let's go for it. It was like a really incredible experience for someone to trust me to do the work. And they let me like design God, right? So you don't see God an aggressive amount in this. But what I thought was important that God had hips and curves. You would probably like assume, right? It was like femme presenting, although you never see God's face, and God has these like silver locks. And God consistently blends into the night sky. And I thought that was important because when we think of any other time, right? When you think of God, like tell me you don't think of like that very Zeus kind of like old white guy in the sky with the
Simpsons
beard.
God of the like yellow hand.
Right. Yeah. Right. Actually, it's funny you say that. I have anyway. I did another piece back in seminary and it was like it was called, oh my gosh, I can't think, something called hip hop, because we did like a hip hop in the prophetics class, and my interpretation of God is actually two hands in the sky throwing up the diamond. But I was really excited about this book, and I was really just like whatever, like by whatever I mean I didn't keep a consistent style per se. I did a lot of like collage kind of work or mixed media.
I loved that. Yeah.
Thanks. I wanted just like a mix of like all the things, because for me growing up, I loved children's books, like the written and illustrated, and I would always go to my uncle's house on the weekends and try to like illustrate my own book.
Aww.
Which is actually why I use my illustrator name as Nikki Faison, because I would always try to do this like written and illustrated by Nikki Faison, which is my maiden name and my childhood nickname. So it was like a gift to myself. Like, you actually did it, girl. Like,
that's fantastic.
Wonderful.
Yeah, that was a lot around my stuff, but the book itself, it really fights the light dark binary. It just tries to challenge that thought, because we're always like, the truth will come to light, and you know, the angels came in white robes, and right? It was lightness and brightness. And so when you think of heavenly divine things, right, you think of white and purity, and like that's dangerous.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So this book talks about the beautiful things that happen in the dark. It talks about, you know, your seeds grow in the dark, luscious soil. And that creates new life. You know, God passed over the Jews, right? In the night. You see things like, you know, God's creations are in the depths of the sea, out in the universe, which is all dark. Like, these are beautiful things around creation. When Jesus died on the cross, right? It went dark for 3 hours. So darkness is consistently used in scripture, and there's these wonderful experiences we have, but we never draw attention to it. So this book just reminds us that there is beauty, there is holiness, and there's sacredness within darkness.
Yeah.
I want to give a quick shout outs to Reverend Kwame Pitts, because a few years ago she did hashtag
I was wondering if there was a connection there, because I was in seminary. Kwame and I were in seminary together, and so
there wasn't a formal connection, but I think that I got to participate in that series as well by written work. And that always sits with me, that Reverend Kwame sat down and found pieces of scripture that talked about darkness and reclaimed that. And other Black theologians did the work to name that. So this conversation around darkness has been happening. And I recommend, if you ever want to go to, I forget, Medium, themedium.com, and hashtag Treasures of Darkness, and you can find that whole series that was done during the month of February. So I'm just really grateful for that.
Yeah, and she did it, and then a couple of years later, maybe, I think she revisited some of the posts, like a following February, too, that people had made. So that's great. The important question, do you now own the label artist?
I'm trying to embrace it more, because now it's like legit, right? Like, people are actually like paying for my art in that sense.
You're a professional artist.
I'm like technically a professional artist, which is, it's just weird. Just big imposter syndrome, you know? Like someone was like, "Oh, you're an artist," and I was like, "I didn't know that until like the other day." So like we're doing this together, you know?
Yeah.
I'm trying to.
Okay. I was gonna say it's legit, not because you're getting paid. It's professional because you're getting paid, but it's just legit because you are an artist. Yeah. So I'm glad you are trying to. I know it's a process, particularly with imposter syndrome, but yeah,
for sure. I'll just say this around it. So before I got my final copy, I was going through Beaming Books, their fall catalog, because Beaming Books is our publisher. Shout outs to them. So I was going through it, and all the books coming up for this season, children's books, in case you have children that you love, bangers, straight bangers. And I'm going through like, you know, all the author illustrator stuff, and like all these illustrators have like MFAs or have done like other series before, and I'm just here like, I'm over here twiddling my thumbs like, I'm a pastor, you know, which I thought was really great. But that's just, feel free to check them out too. The other children's books are really good.
Yeah.
You know, since we have this platform, although I have no idea who listens to this podcast, I suppose I should ask, if, assuming that they were going to, of course, pay you properly for your work, would you be open to doing another book?
Oh, yeah.
Or something like
or
that?
Commissions, or...
Absolutely. I'd be open to it. I would definitely be open to it. That's like an absolute... It was a fun and chaotic project, and as long as someone is willing to work with my chaotic schedule and my, like, mental hold, because sometimes I'm like, it's been a week out, and, like, I'm just hitting a roadblock right now. Yeah, and now that, like, we've done it, I know how to do it better, so...
Awesome. And we will link to your stuff in our episode description so that people can find you for sure.
Thanks.
Yeah.
So in the hopes of actually connecting all of this to the Bible, which I suppose we should, we picked this topic because both our Genesis and our Luke readings today involve people providing hospitality, which is frequently an unacknowledged role. And so although this is, of course, a false binary question, are you a Mary or a Martha?
That's a great one. So I think just by like aesthetic, I'm a Mary. Like I said this earlier, like I'm not domestic. You're not gonna find me being like, oh, can't listen to this person now. Gotta go fix something. Like no, chances are I'm gonna be like, yeah, no, tell me more. Like so, Mary based on that.
Yeah, I think I'm kind of a half and half. On the one hand, the ADHD explosion in my brain a couple years ago kind of destroyed my ability to cook, unfortunately. Yeah. And I am not really a natural cleaner myself. But in terms of being a Martha, I am absolutely the person who will check with the family who's grieving at a funeral 8 different times to make sure, did you eat real food today? Are you sure? Have you checked? And also, making sure that people are comfortable, that kind of thing. But I am much more a Mary in that I would much rather just sit and listen to you talk than, do physical stuff instead. That is much more my speed.
Yeah. I also think I'm more of a Mary, though just like the work and schedules mean that I have to Martha. And so like I'm good at Marthaing when I need to, but yeah, I would rather not be doing all of the household things and just like sitting and being present with people.
Yeah. Can I tell y'all the experience I had with the scripture that completely blew my mind?
Yes.
Ooh, yes, please.
Okay. And I'm sure as theologians yourselves, you've probably already like been there, done that with this stuff. So excuse my like childlike, response to this. But I remember when I was in seminary, I was sitting in the basement. No, was it in the basement? Maybe I wasn't in seminary and I did this in seminary. But I remember hearing a woman preach about this, and she actually stopped and said, the term that was used around Martha was housework. And the actual Greek says diakonia.
Wow.
Okay, cool. So we're all just learning it for the So she said the actual Greek for this was diakonia, which we understand as like the Lord's work, right? A servant's work.
Yes.
And it was misinterpreted, right? Because Martha is obviously not a man's. So the suggestion that she was making was that Martha was not just doing housework, but she was doing the Lord's work, which brought her to suggest that actually this was a house church. And so Mary and Martha actually were running the first house church during this time period. And so,
I love that.
so as we create this binary, like, are you Mary, are you Martha, or this? No, they're taking on different tasks within this building of church, right? So when Martha's like, can you tell her to like join me and like do this stuff right now? Because she's thinking, right, like we're trying to build this kingdom, right, Jesus? Like we're trying to like change people's hearts and like do justice, and Jesus is kind of like, let's just chill for a second and like regather ourselves, right? Like there's space and time for this too, right?
Yeah.
How much do you want to bet that half of what Martha was doing was emotional labor?
Oh, are you kidding me? All of them. I guarantee you. Look. I bet you Mary was doing some emotional labor right there. Jesus probably like, let me tell you about when I was out here in Jerusalem. And she's like, oh my God, Jesus, do you want me to go fight them? Do you need a home cooked meal? Mary was probably over there listening to Jesus's woes and not having space for herself.
Yeah.
And that's not shady to Jesus. That's the time, right? So that was so liberating to think of like removing the Mary Martha dynamic out of like this like kind of like chatty woman thing that we tend to do with this particular scripture, because we do that, right? It's that same thing we talked about earlier. We don't get many different identities for women. We create this box. You're either this or you're that. You're either cleaning or you're like being lazy. And like it removes that. Just that one term, diakonita, removes us from that and gives a lot more depth to these two characters in scripture. And I really love that.
Yeah.
That is like mind blown.
That's fabulous. So our first reading for today is from Genesis chapter 18, verses 1 through 10a. God sends messengers in disguise to Abraham and Sarah, who are hospitable to them. At the end of their visit, the messengers promised the couple that Sarah will have a child.
So, one of the themes in this is obviously hospitality. This is part of a whole larger section, and we will get into more of that next week. Yes, next week we're talking about Sodom and Gomorrah. I promise it's more good news, not queerphobic, but this is part of like a larger section in Genesis on hospitality. And as I was like thinking about it, I was like, so Abraham is basically like C-3PO. Like C-3PO is there to provide hospitality, to provide translation services, all of that stuff. He doesn't necessarily like do the things, but he facilitates. He supervises the things that are happening. Like, yep, that's Abraham. Yeah.
Oh man, C-3PO being a manager makes everything so much more makes sense. Yeah, absolutely. So as we jump into the verses, in verse 2 we read, Abraham looked up and saw 3 men standing near him. When he saw them, he ran from the tent entrance to meet them and bowed down to the ground. So in this verse, we see Abraham carrying out biblical hospitality. And in a lot of fiction, we see that hospitality in extreme environments, such as deserts, tend to be pretty well established. This is also something we see in real life. Fiction is borrowing from real life. I am very fond of Frank Herbert's novel Dune, and one of the first things that the Atreides family changes on arriving on the planet Arrakis is to change the welcoming rite for guests at rich people's dinner banquets, basically, because it used to be that it involved publicly wasting water, and instead they change it to giving water to the poor. In order to hopefully improve their relationship with the rest of the planet. And that turns out to be a bit of a bigger thing than they expect it to be. But biblical hospitality was hugely important, and Abraham is carrying out just one step of it here.
Well, and still today, I think when we hear about Middle Eastern hospitality, like the way that it is so ingrained in culture to be hospitable. As someone who grew up in a tourist town, like there's complexities and like overlapping of like tourism and the push for like the enforced hospitality as like catering to tourists who are paying money, but also like it's something that what I have heard from people who have lived there is we could learn a lot of things about hospitality. And then in verse 8 we read, then Abraham took curds and milk and the calf that he had prepared and set it before them, and he stood by them under the tree while they ate. So this also still works with like C-3PO, but really I'm like, okay, now Abraham sounds like a vampire, right? Like particularly like Angel from the Buffy and Angel verse, right? Like where I just watched an episode and they were all out to dinner, right? And like it does him no good to eat food, and so he's just like sitting with them while the rest of them are like eating a dinner to celebrate Cordelia getting an acting job. So it's just like, sure, I'll provide all the things and then just stand and watch you, not as creepily as Edward, but still a little creepily while you eat and I do not.
Right.
But yeah.
Yeah, also I have my doubts about how much of the cooking he did, but that's just me.
Yeah, I was gonna say, when you read it, it's kind of like, Sarah, can you do all these things?
Yeah. Like, and that we skipped over a little bit, but yeah, Sarah made all the bread. The servants probably did actually the curds and milk and calf and invisible labor.
Yeah, I think that's what always stands out, right? Like, I don't know. With this particular text, I'm really reflecting on this. Abraham kind of being like a vampire, just staring over them. I also see myself doing that a lot when I make food for people, and I'm like, "Yeah, please eat. Was it good? Like, yeah, thanks. I tried. You know."
Yeah,
sure.
But that's also like that's a cultural thing too. I know of a variety of different women who will cook. Will like have a party or have guests over and will do all of the cooking and serving and will be the last ones to eat if they eat in the same room at all. And there's
when I talk to grieving families at funerals, one of the things I do is I check in with the matriarch to make sure that she's eating, because if she's not, then the whole family's going to fall apart when she falls down.
Yeah, I always weddings and funerals both, like you make sure that the like people at the center have the food.
Yeah.
Are eating the food.
Real food. Yep.
Yeah.
Our second reading is Colossians chapter 1, verses 15 through 28. The author contemplates the mysteries of the everlasting God in Christ, who chooses to have a relationship with humanity. I love mystery, and I think it goes really well also with the book that you illustrated, Nick. Like part of what is so beautiful about darkness is that there is a mystery in it, especially when it's like the night, which I love. And it's also one of those like the mystery, like we have been taught that's a scary thing, right? We've been taught to fear mystery and to fear questions. And so I love the way that like when we approach mystery with wonder or awe, which is what the author of Colossians is doing right now, but also what holy darkness invites us into. It's much less, Scooby-Doo mystery, scary stuff, and more like Yoda mystery, contemplating things. Although I do now want to watch the like episode or movie Scooby-Doo and the Mysteries of God.
And now I'm asking myself, if Paul had a mystery van, what would be painted on the side? And I think one of Nick's illustrations of God might be a great choice.
Ooh, yeah. That would be awesome.
Yeah.
And then in verse 23, we read, provided that you continue securely established and steadfast in the faith, without shifting from the hope promised by the gospel that you heard, which has been proclaimed to every creature under heaven. But how do you proclaim the hope promised by the gospel to an ostrich? Like, I get how you could do it to, like, elephants, because they have this thing around the, like, cycles of the moon, and they grieve and all of that stuff, and they're just the best animals anyway. But, like, to proclaim it to every creature under heaven means you proclaimed it to an ostrich. And I just need to know, like, how that worked.
I mean, right, so hear me out. I would hold a mirror up to the ostrich and be like, look at you! Look at you! You are a mystery! I don't get you! You know?
Yeah, see, that was going to be my response for the duck-billed platypus.
Like
the way that the rest of us see you is how we also see God. We don't get it either.
That's fantastic.
You are the image of God, a mystery.
I love it. That's brilliant.
Yeah. In verse 26, we read, the mystery that has been hidden throughout the ages and generations, but has now been revealed to his saints. Which is not that there is a last scion or descendant of Jesus or whatever hiding out waiting for us to find them to fulfill a prophecy. I have so many issues. Like, okay, on the one hand, if we're going with the movie Dogma, I actually have way less of an issue with that, because this shows that God has a sense of humor. And if Alan Rickman, now that he's in the afterlife, wants to spend his time being the voice of God, I totally support that choice on both Alan Rickman and God's part, because that is a decent choice, absolutely. But if we're going more in the Dan Brown direction of these things, I am grateful on a daily basis that my prediction about Dan Brown's terrible books have come true, in that they have become essentially irrelevant to the larger society, thank God, rather than my professor's prediction, which was that they would take the church in a new, deeply weird and screwed up direction. We have gone in a new, deeply weird and screwed up direction, but it had almost nothing to do with Dan Brown, which I'll be grateful for the little things, whatever. But I was in college when his books were coming out, and it sent the entire religion department into a tizzy, and I am so grateful that I don't have to deal with those conversations anymore, because I actually did a paper on the, 47 different really, truly obvious irrelevancies and inaccuracies in the...
What was that?
And anyway, in his most well-known book. Yeah, exactly. See? No one cares
Well
anymore.
done.
But I did a 10-page paper on the many inaccuracies, and at that point I had never been to France. I've spent 10 minutes of my life in France by now. And I could spot the obvious geographical inaccuracies about how Paris is laid out, and that was a sign of how terrible this book was. He had the Louvre on the wrong side of town.
Oh.
It was amazing.
I could have used that book when I read The Da Vinci Code. Perfect.
The Da Vinci Code, thank you, yes.
I could have used that book when I read
I
it.
can probably still find the paper on my computer.
Please, because when I read it, I was in high school, so I didn't have any of the knowledge, and I was I don't know what is real and what is not.
Yeah, I literally found one internet comment saying he has no idea what Paris is even like, and I went off of that and started looking at maps, and lo and behold, it was just an absolute nightmare. Anyway.
So, Horror Nerds at Church just did a Twilight Vampire season, so it's kind of like when Stephanie Myers was Forks, let me tell you all the things about this place that I've never been to, and these people that I don't know, and thus we get the Twilight books. Yeah.
Yeah. This is why you make up towns to set your fictional story in, people. That's how that works. Yeah. Speaking as someone who went to seminary in Dubuque and knows a few things about how inaccurate people's expectations of that place is, but...
That's real. That's real.
Mm-hmm. And then our gospel reading today is from Luke chapter 10, verses 38 through 42. Martha invites Jesus to her home, and she and Mary welcome him in different ways. Jesus praises Mary's focus on listening.
So, we have already talked about this whole mind-blowing new direction for this passage. But also, part of this is unacknowledged labor, right? The lack of acknowledgement that Martha feels about the labor she's doing. And thanks to Nick's brilliance from her seminary brilliance, also the potential labor that Mary is doing for Jesus. And our household is watching What We Do in the Shadows, which is mockumentary about vampires, and their familiar Guillermo is basically this, right? He does all of this stuff and is hardly acknowledged at all. And then we just watched an episode where he quit and everything was falling apart. None of the candles were getting blown out. There were dead bodies everywhere, all of this stuff. And it's just this is what happens. This is why universal strikes and labor strikes and stuff, as we talked about in our third Sunday after Pentecost episode with Ale.
Yeah.
This is why those work.
Fourth Sunday,
you're right.
Ale is fourth
Sunday, sorry. This is why those work. Because then all of a sudden it's, oh, this is what's going on. Okay.
Yeah. Here's my hot take. Our churches were built under this model.
Yeah.
Right? Our churches were all built under this model. Specifically the idea that our retired elders, which oftentimes are women, would just come in and donate their time and energy between running councils, fixing stuff, doing coffee hour, cleaning up pieces. And that's just not a realistic place for us to be in, because our economy does not even permit that. It doesn't permit people to actually retire.
Yep.
Yeah.
And we see that even now as stories come out about people are running through their 401ks because they didn't know how much money they needed to save for retirement, right? That's a whole thing. And that's your middle class people. We're not even talking about the poor folk that have not been, able to actually retire.
Yeah.
And so as we talk about this invisible labor, this actually reminds me of my previous congregation, and, you know, glory and God to them. They're amazing. But there was one person that lived at the church who did not pay rent, but was kind of like the keeper. They had all the keys to everything. In the winter, we had like a, you know, 40-something-year boiler that like would leak or needed to be like drained every few hours. And this is like in the middle of the night, like every 2 hours in the middle of the night kind of stuff.
Oof.
Wow.
There would be, you know, garbage, fridges getting cleaned, all of that stuff, right? We would make meals for the community. So that meant the kitchen really had to get like scrubbed down.
Mm-hmm.
All of this stuff, huge building. Even if special events happened, oh, pastor, do you want me to do da 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 da? When this person moved out, our building immediately went to a mess. Immediately.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't that we didn't know. We were not prepared for the loss. And there was an assumption that her male counterpart, who also lived at the building, would kind of help out a little bit more, as they've, you know, been roommates, and this person, you know, did music for the church. And like that really wasn't an immediate transition.
Mm-hmm.
And then when this person started realizing how much was lost in between, whether it was cleaning bathrooms or things like that, it was kind of like, well, I guess I can shovel, or I guess I can such and such, right? But again, the expectation or the responsibility of maintaining this space and things that we didn't even realize was being done was on this woman. And so this is, I think, as we're just talking about the invisible labor, we kind of explore the idea of like the servant's work or the Lord's work. As I think now about church and what our church looks like today, it just reminds me of how unsustainable this model is, especially without community taking care of each other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the like dynamic and expectation that you will donate some of your time, whether you are a pastor or a parishioner who also works for the church or whatever, that like I'm very clear that like if you are employed, you do not volunteer for the same organization.
Right.
You like if you really want to like show up at like the craft fair, you can show up, but you're not working. You're not doing you're not setting it up, you're not cleaning it up, you're not. But that's a thing that happens to pastors and lay people, and it is a very gendered dynamic for sure.
A lot of people think it's clergy, especially now that there's a half-time expectation essentially in our church that's growing more common to have half-time ministers. They think that they can just donate their labor, right? I'm going to volunteer more time. And what that does actually is it sets a precedent. Whether or not they want to acknowledge it, then there's an expectation of, well, this person who came before you, so this is now becomes this work of the pastor. And then more conflict and boundaries are like, it just becomes really complicated when like the next person comes in, you know?
Yeah. And we've been fighting that fight for years now. Like, I was a part-time lay minister for a congregation like 15 years ago now, where I came in, the previous pastor had just retired and had been working 80-hour weeks for them. And I had to explain, I have a boyfriend in one state, my parents are in another state, I have a cat, I may not, have children, but I have a life, and I am not going to be able to do this, even if I wanted to, which I don't, because this guy's only hobby was putting together giant jigsaw puzzles in his basement, and that sounds so unspeakably miserable to me.
I mean, I love jigsaw puzzles, so I would be there for that.
Like,
but,
sure, fine, but like, hours alone in your basement, no, please no. And it took them a while to figure out that actually, yes, I could get their, 20 different monthly visits in 4 separate counties done each month, but like I needed to actually separate out time for that and intentionally schedule it. And gracious.
Yeah, I would much prefer part-time ministry at this stage of like where I'm at in my own life and like the personal projects like a podcast that I'm doing. But I will be very clear about like the boundaries, and I have found that for a lot of women especially, there is this like, oh, I can't say no, I can't do, and it's the thing that seems to get through is you are setting up other people for failure when you overwork. Yeah. Right? When you don't stop working when your hours are up, they will assume that the person who comes next will do the same thing. And there are different like dynamics of generational thing, but we're at a stage where like women want better. I think a lot of women want better for whoever comes next. than they even like are willing to acknowledge they deserve. And so then like the trying to get them to have boundaries and take days off and take vacation and all of that stuff is easier if I'm saying, if you don't take it, they will think that the next person won't take it.
Because it's so much easier for so many of us to do something for someone else than it is to do it for ourselves. Because if you're doing this for your little sister or for the person who comes next or whatever, you can talk yourself into it better. Yeah.
Which is a whole other problematic. That's a whole other.
Our planet could use some therapy. Yeah. And then in verse 40a, the first half of verse 40, we read, "But Martha was distracted by her many tasks." And I have become something of an expert on multitasking, in part thanks to the ADHD. And there are people who have very strong opinions about that sort of thing. You should never multitask. You should always give 100% to whatever it is, the one thing that you're doing at that time. And for some of us, not multitasking is literally impossible. Like, I would go completely spare if I tried to do that. But on the other hand, it's not impossible to multitask, but it does have its limits. I find that I can multitask doing several fairly simply and not like deeply involving or deeply emotional or deep kind of thoughtful tasks at once. But if you're trying to do really deep intentional thinking about a subject, I can really only have one task to keep my hands busy rather than several things at a time at the same time. I can't, write a paper and also have a Zoom conversation about emotional labor and also knit and also do 14 other things at the same time. But I can be a part of a conversation at, say, a conference about the importance of anti-racism work while also having something to fidget with my hands just to keep that extra part of my brain calmed down. And I find that helpful. But also there are people who literally can't multitask. They have to focus on one thing at a time. And really it's just a matter of finding what works for you. And it's possible that Martha was effectively multitasking and was like just working differently than Jesus was used to. And since Jesus is God's only experience of being human, maybe God wasn't aware that this can work several different ways. But we will never know at this rate.
That reminds me of the people that knit, that bring knitting to conferences and church and stuff. And this right circles right back around. Knitting and creating clothing or whatever you're knitting or crocheting, right, is deeply gendered work, is deeply undervalued. Like if you ever are paying for stuff, it's really hard for it to be properly valued. But then also like people get told, less so today, I think, but people have historically been told like that they're not paying attention when they're knitting. But it's like you were saying, like doing something physical with their hands that they like can do without looking helps their brain. I used to play Tetris in one of my classes in seminary because I could do that without my brain. And it actually, like the couple times where I tried to do it without playing Tetris, the professor was like very not type A. So, like, they just, like, were super scattered and all over the place, and I just couldn't follow them. But if I had Tetris going on, I could follow what was happening.
You have to keep that extra piece of your brain busy. In high school, I spent years drawing little Ewok villages, like little treehouse villages on the edges of my notebook paper.
That's adorable. That's adorable. I looked at the second half of the verse, and after, like, acknowledging that Martha is very distracted, she comes to Jesus and says, "Do you not care that my sister has left me to do all the work by myself? Tell her then to help me." And as I was reading it, I was like, this is an Enneagram 2's nightmare. They are doing all of the things, and they finally ask for help, and then they're told that they're, like, doing the wrong thing, and it's not a priority. And I was just like, even vampire families don't do it alone. Vampirina has her parents, and Chef Remy, and Gregoria, and Demi, plus Wolfie. Not that Wolfie really, like, helps things, but probably emotionally Wolfie does. And Demi is only semi-helpful ever because he's, like, super coded as a, like, white cis gay man. So, if even Vampirina's family needs help, and they're vampires, then certainly the rest of us could use some help, too.
I think there's a few things in here that stick out to me, but I think y'all brought up some really great points about like neurodivergence in particular, of like the I need to keep myself occupied, like I need to do this, and I really honor that. I think those are really good points that I didn't really consider before. when I'm reading this, there's a few things that pop out to me. Martha being distracted by like her many tasks. I can imagine on one end feeling like this is a time I can get my things done.
Mm-hmm.
And also I'm hearing like this call to like be still and know that I am God, like from Jesus.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
I think what I can appreciate about that is that I'm also a person that like I need to be doing stuff. Like I've counted my bracelet here several times and I've done like so many different little patterns. And I really struggle personally with just like being still. I struggle with meditation. I can't calm my mind well.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that's a challenge for me. But and maybe this is my own internalized stuff, but I always like wish I could do that. Like, some people can just be still. And hearing Jesus, I don't know, I think hearing Jesus being like, hey, look, Mary's choosing to like just do this one thing, and like I'm not gonna stop her from that. Like I feel almost envious in the way of like, man, like I don't think I would just be able to do that either, because I've been in spaces where like when I'm not leading something, I'm ready to like go off and do the next thing I have to do and like come back to it. But what I also appreciate, and I know we didn't get to this part yet, but you know what he says is, Martha, you're worried and distracted by many things, but few things are needed, indeed only one. Mary has chosen the better part, which will not be taken away from her. And like, maybe the better part was a little shady, but other than that though, he's not like, dang, you suck. Like, he's not like, Martha, how dare you do this thing? He's just like, sis, like, I'm not going to stop her from doing the thing that like she is prioritizing or that she cares about. And I think it was a good like both and thing. Like, yeah, you can have your priorities and you can have your goals and your wants, and like this is hers.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
And like
Boundaries.
I'm not coming for her. And I feel like very neutral. And that's kind of hard because I think you're pointing it too, right? Like she's asking for help, right? And none of us want to be turned down when we finally ask for help, especially people that might struggle with vulnerability.
Mm-hmm.
But that's also like an interesting boundary thing that he's creating of like, no, this is not where I'm putting my energy.
Yeah. Well, and I think it goes back to the conversation about like when people apologize or criticism, receiving and giving criticism, that like I do always read it as Jesus being critical of Martha, because that is how it has always been taught to me up until, you know, whenever we started recording this. But it's not. It is, Jesus is not saying, Martha, don't do your things. Jesus is saying, I'm not stopping Mary. And there is this like, someone's not doing the thing that I asked them to do, that's not helping me. And so I'm like feeling like the shame and the blame and the guilt that like is so ingrained in us to feel when we don't get our way, when we don't get the help.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That's so good. That's so good.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I think that's like a really great way of putting it. And it's reminding me of just like the culture that we're in. Of like, we struggle with yeses and nos, or like receiving feedback and criticism. We take a lot of things super personally, and we like just go the complete opposite way. And I can imagine the person reading that, that's now teaching us this stuff, is like, well, obviously Jesus rejected Martha, and like that's like, I don't know, like I feel like it's like just like trickle down projections.
Yep.
And especially for those who like love the meditating and being one spot and just concentrated on Jesus, like it's an easy way to like weaponize that story of like, you got to stop everything for Jesus, and like that's not what's happening.
Right.
Yeah.
There actually is space, there is room in there. I don't know, there's a lot here. I think there's a lot that we don't often talk about.
I also have dreams of, I am not a meditative person. Like meditation and sitting still doesn't work for me either. I have dreams of like teaching a spiritual directions / spiritual practices class that's spiritual practices for the non-contemplative, that actually is like spiritual practices for people who can't sit still, and like digging into activism as a spiritual practice, but also like praying in color, which is a thing that Sybil Macbeth has done that I like love. But yeah, all of those different places of like, what does it look like to acknowledge and honor the diversity of ways that we do that.
Yeah, for sure.
And now it is the time for our newest-ish. It's no longer, in July, it doesn't feel like it's necessarily new, but it's still our newest segment. Let's make a Muppets musical. So, Pastor Nick, who would you cast for this episode? Muppet or token human?
Oh my god. So, hear me out. For the Luke one, honestly, I'm getting Bert and Ernie vibes. I know you said Muppets.
They count. They
but
count.
like
No, they
as a
Muppets.
okay.
Yeah.
I was as a toddler mom right now, Sesame Street is like all I'm doing.
Big Bird did a thing at Jim Henson's funeral. They all count.
Yep.
So I see like a Bert and Ernie thing, and low key, like I think with Jesus, like I would want to do a Big Bird, but that doesn't make sense because Big Bird is kind of really passive, and I'm thinking of someone who can kind of be like
a little more sweet,
you know,
Oscar.
Yeah. No, wait, Grover.
Ooh.
Grover, yes.
Grover is my hot take. Or
especially, and there's that ongoing thing about how no one knows what Grover is.
Wait.
And that would explain a lot about Jesus.
No, there is actually a different character who I'm thinking of for Jesus. I'll tell you right now.
I was thinking of Miss Piggy for Martha, but that was before we had all this conversation. So I love the Bert and Ernie.
Yeah, the Bert and Ernie for Mary and Martha, I really like. Ernie would absolutely be the one sitting by Jesus, and Bert would be fluffing around doing all sorts of things and being angry about it.
Hear me out. The Count as Jesus.
I do like it, yes. Certainly counting the things that, Bert is doing.
You have
slowly.
One desk, 2 desks, 3 desks.
I love that. And then, some random disciple in the background is a human and just watching all of this slack-jawed. So confused. Yes. I don't understand. Yeah.
That is fantastic.
That's my hot take.
That's wonderful. Yeah.
Yeah. Did you have any that you were thinking of, Kay?
I mean, with Martha doing the household tasks thing, I'm trying to figure out how to work the Swedish chef into this. I would love the idea, if they're running a house church, of course they have to hire someone else to cook. And so the Swedish chef can be in the background.
That's good.
Floop-de-dooping and talking about forks and so on. And I think that would bring a lovely energy of hecticness into Martha's life that would explain a lot about why she's so distracted. And if Grover's there, then of course Camilla has to be there too, which would probably add to the general wackiness of what's going on.
I like Bert and Ernie, but if the Swedish chef was Martha and Grover was Jesus, Camilla could be Mary.
Oh, that's very sweet.
That is very sweet.
But you had to...
Except that Martha winds up wanting to cook Mary in that story, and I'm not sure that's where this is going.
We're going to have to reform the Swedish chef a little bit.
Yeah.
Okay. I have a big, what's it called? Miss Piggy as Sarah, Kermit as Abraham, and the 2-headed monster as the folks receiving hospitality.
I do love that, except that Kermit isn't really the type to take credit for other people's work.
But I feel like Kermit would definitely let Miss Piggy get the butt of, the short end of the stick.
Very possibly. And would certainly, encourage other people to enjoy her hospitality. But, yeah.
That's brilliant.
I was trying to card through the list of options for Abraham, and my favorite option was definitely Sam Eagle, the blue guy, for Abraham, because he loves going around telling people what to do.
I'm into it.
And can you imagine Statler and Waldorf as the angels and complaining about all of the stuff going on and how none of it's up to snuff?
That one. That's a really good one.
That is good. I feel like Sam Eagle is one of our go-tos for, the person we don't necessarily like, or the person that's, not doing really well. Which, makes sense, because he's the, patriotic propaganda machine.
He's kind of Berkey. Yeah.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I do like Statler and Waldorf as the angels.
I do, too. Yeah. I do, too, a lot.
I think they'd have a good time, even if they wouldn't admit it.
Yeah.
So, Nick, any other thoughts on life, the universe, and everything?
Any other thoughts? Oh my gosh. I mean, I want to end with a very positive note, but I feel like with everything going on in the world, it's so draining, and it's hard to tell people keep fighting, stay strong. We got this. We're in there. Because it just doesn't feel like that right now. And I feel like today is this day of grief and lament overall. And even as we talk about these scriptures, what we're seeing is very repetitive mischaracterizations, or again, the invisible labor of which oftentimes in these stories of women. And to think that after hundreds, if not thousands of years, we're rewarded, at least in this context, with a loss of bodily autonomy and human rights. It is very hard to see where the good news is in all of this.
Yeah.
So it feels very much like the tomb. And I think that's an okay place for us to be in. I think it's an okay place for us to be in that period between Friday and Sunday and be in this question of uncertainty.
Yeah.
As you were saying that, I was like, we don't have that space enough. We don't admit that, like, where we are is the tomb. And like, I know particularly queer people whose favorite time of the church year is Lent, because they don't have to be artificially happy. Whose favorite holiday is Good Friday, because they don't have to fake happiness and joy, and they get to actually, like, just exist in the space of, as you said, grief and lament.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Oh, this conversation has been amazing. And not just because now I have, like, a whole direction for my sermon that's like half a month away. This has been really fantastic, and I'm so grateful that you were able to be with us and to share your wisdom. Thank you.
Absolutely.
So much.
Yeah, thank you for letting me just kind of rant and rave with y'all. This is honestly a joy, and I'm really glad to be able to share God's holy darkness with y'all and some of my problematic hot takes with Abraham. So thank you.
I mean, I don't find them problematic, but I like them. Yeah.
Absolutely.
And dear listeners, thank you for joining us. Catch us next time when we'll discuss nerdery connections to the scripture readings for the 7th Sunday after Pentecost. This podcast has been produced by us, Emily Ewing and Kay Roloff. For more fun, check us out on Twitter and Facebook at Nerds at Church, or contact us at nerdsatchurch@gmail.com.
Also, if you like what you've heard, rate us or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Facebook, or wherever you catch your podcasts. If you want access to our uncut guest episodes and interviews, live Q&As, and more, support us on Patreon at patreon.com/nerdsatchurch. It's cheaper than buying your own Muppet.
Then the amount you should be compensated for the hour of emotional labor that you do every couple hours.
Or even the amount of emotional labor you did listening to this podcast.
Ding, ding, ding.
Yes, exactly.
Thanks for listening.
Also, let us know on Facebook or Twitter who you would cast for Let's Make a Muppets musical for this episode.
As the ancient Christians said,
Pax
Pax
Vobiscum.
Vobiscum.